Okay, so, human sexuality. It's one of those things that you might think at first glance is pretty simple, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, biology, attraction, some societal rules.
Right. Like that's kind of the basic picture. But then you dig into all this research and wow, it just explodes that idea.
It's so true. I mean, just looking at the material you sent over for this deep dive, the sources are amazing. Really gets you thinking about how deep this all goes. It's not just like a chapter in a biology textbook or something.
No, not at all. It really gets into like who we are at our core, our relationships, how we feel about ourselves, the whole picture.
Absolutely. And with these sources on AI and human sexuality, it's really fascinating. Like, we're going way beyond just the human experience here.
Totally.
Right.
So our mission for this deep dive is, well, we want to get to the heart of it all. Like, where does our sexuality come from? How do we express it? How has it changed over time? And what kind of impact does it have on, well, everything?
Right. We're looking for those big aha moments, those insights that make you see it all in a new way.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so I guess the best place to start is, well, the beginning, the biology, right?
Yeah, the biology is fundamental. And one thing the sources really emphasize is that the biology of sexuality goes way beyond just, how we reproduce.
Okay, so more than just the mechanics of it all.
Right. I mean, it includes our anatomy and all, but it's also about what happens in our bodies, all those physiological responses. Your heart beating faster, changes in blood flow, muscles tensing up.
Wow, yeah. I never really thought about all that.
It's amazing. And it's all orchestrated by this super intricate interplay between our nervous system and hormones like androgens and estrogens. A really important androgen is testosterone, for example. It's essential for things like, well, how our sexual characteristics develop.
It really makes you realize that it's not just about, the act itself. It's like a whole body experience.
It really is. And it's not like it just switches on when we hit puberty and then disappears.
Oh, you mean it's there throughout our whole lives?
Exactly. Which makes you think, right, if it's not just about having kids, then what other roles might it be playing? And that brings us to evolution.
Okay, so how does human sexuality fit into the whole evolutionary picture?
Well, one of the biggest things is that sexual reproduction, where you have genetic material from two individuals combining, leads to genetic diversity. And that's a huge advantage.
In what way?
Well, think about it. Each new person is like a unique combination of genes. And that means that as a species, we're more likely to have individuals with the traits they need to survive no matter what happens.
Okay, I see. So like if everyone was genetically identical and some new disease came along?
Exactly. It could wipe everyone out. But with variety, there's a much higher chance that some individuals will have the genes to resist the disease, adapt to a changing environment, you name it.
It's like having a backup plan for the species, right?
That's a good way to put it. And the sources also talk about sexual selection, which is fascinating. It's not just about surviving, it's about finding a mate and passing on your genes.
Right. So it's like competition for partners.
Yeah. And that competition, along with the specific things that individuals find attractive in a mate, have actually shaped a lot of the, crazy and amazing physical characteristics and behaviors we see in nature. Like, think about birds with their colorful feathers or those insects that do these elaborate mating dances.
It's wild. Okay, so we've got the biology, the evolutionary side of things. But, it's not just about bodies and genes. It's also about how we experience and understand sexuality on a personal level.
Right, and that brings us to psychology and the concepts of sexual orientation and gender identity.
Okay, so let's start with sexual orientation. What exactly is it? How do we understand it today?
So basically, sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to. It includes emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction. But it's not just about who you're attracted to at any given moment. It's a lasting pattern, and it really forms a part of your identity. And the sources are really clear on this. It's not a choice.
Right. It's not like you just decide one day, oh, I'm going to be attracted to this type of person.
Exactly. Instead, it seems to come from this, super complex mix of things like biology, hormones, maybe even some environmental factors. It's still a bit of a mystery, to be honest.
But there's a lot of research out there that points towards it being largely biological, right?
Yeah. There's really compelling evidence from twin studies, for example. They've found that if one identical twin is gay or lesbian, there's a much higher chance that the other twin will be too, compared to fraternal twins.
So that suggests some kind of genetic link.
Exactly. And then there's research on prenatal hormones. It seems like the levels of certain hormones, like testosterone, while a baby's brain is developing in the womb, might play a role in who they're attracted to later in life.
That's fascinating. It's like our brains are being wired for attraction even before we're born.
It seems that way. And then there's even research showing some differences in brain structure between people with different sexual orientations.
Wow. It's pretty amazing to see how all these different pieces of research are coming together to give us a better understanding of something so fundamental.
Absolutely. Now, what about gender identity?
Right. So how is gender identity different from sexual orientation?
Well, gender identity is about your own internal sense of being male, female, or maybe another gender. The sources are really clear that this is totally separate from the sex you were assigned at birth, based on your physical characteristics.
Okay, so like someone might be assigned female at birth, but internally they feel like a man.
Right. Or they might feel like neither male nor female, or maybe both. It's about your deep inner sense of who you are. And again, it seems like it comes down to a whole bunch of factors: genes, prenatal hormones, your social environment, how you were raised. It's complex.
Right, so nature and nurture are both involved.
Absolutely. And we see this in some of the research. For example, there are studies on a condition called CAH, congenital adrenal hyperplasia. It's where genetic females are exposed to higher levels of androgens before they're born.
Okay, and what have they found?
Well, these girls often display more male-typical behaviors and interests. It's not always the case, but it happens often enough to be really interesting.
That's pretty compelling. It's like, even though they're biologically female, the hormonal exposure during development has had an impact on their gender identity.
Exactly. And then there's the research using brain imaging. They've looked at the brains of transgender individuals and found that certain areas might be more similar to the brains of cisgender people who share their gender identity rather than the sex they were assigned at birth.
So like a transgender woman's brain might be more similar in some ways to the brain of a cisgender woman, even though she was assigned male at birth.
That's the idea. Now, I know this can be confusing, especially when people talk about, a man brain or a woman brain.
Right, it's not like someone is literally walking around with a brain from a different sex.
Exactly. It's not about a physical brain transplant. It's more about recognizing that the way our brains develop, especially those parts related to gender identity, can sometimes follow a different path than how our bodies develop. It's all part of the amazing variability of human biology. And the sources are really careful to frame this as natural variation, not some kind of disorder or mistake.
I think that's a really important point. It's about recognizing and respecting the full spectrum of human experiences.
Couldn't agree more. Now, on top of all this biology and psychology, we also have to consider how society shapes our understanding and experience of sexuality.
Right. Because even if we have these innate biological and psychological factors, the culture we live in has a huge impact on how we express our sexuality, what's considered okay and what's not.
Yeah, it's like there's this whole other layer on top, and it varies so much around the world. Like, what's totally normal in one culture might be taboo in another.
And a lot of that comes down to things like cultural norms, beliefs, and values, right?
Absolutely. And religion plays a huge role in shaping those things. Like, think about attitudes towards premarital sex or same-sex relationships. Those can vary drastically depending on the dominant religious beliefs in a society.
Right. And it's not just religion. It's also about the laws a country has, which often reflect those underlying cultural norms.
Definitely. And it goes even deeper than that. Like the media we consume, the education we receive, even our own families all contribute to how we understand sexuality.
Right. It's like we're all being socialized in specific ways of thinking about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why the sources are so big on comprehensive sex education. They argue that it's crucial for giving young people accurate information, challenging harmful stereotypes, and helping them make informed decisions about their own sexual health and well-being.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's about moving beyond just the basics and giving people the tools they need to navigate the complexities of sexuality in a healthy and respectful way.
Totally. No, I think it's really interesting to look back at how all this has changed over time, historically.
Oh, yeah, I'm curious about that. So, like, how have attitudes towards sexuality evolved throughout history?
Well, one thing that's really clear is that they haven't stayed the same. What's been considered acceptable or unacceptable has shifted quite a bit over the centuries.
So it's not like there's been this one unchanging view of sexuality throughout human history.
Not at all. We've seen periods of greater tolerance, and then times where certain expressions of sexuality were heavily condemned. And the way we think about sexuality has often been tied up with ideas about gender, too. Like, historically, male sexuality was often linked to dominance and procreation.
Right. was all about spreading those genes.
Yeah. While female sexuality was much more controlled, usually connected to reproduction within marriage, the focus was on things like virginity before marriage and being faithful to your husband.
That's a pretty big difference.
It is. And even the idea of homosexuality as a specific identity is relatively new, especially in Western culture. It really only emerged in the late 19th century.
So before that, how did people think about same-sex attraction?
It wasn't so much seen as a fundamental part of who you are, but more as a specific behavior, maybe even a sin in some cultures.
That's a really different way of looking at it.
It is, and it shows how much our understanding of sexuality has changed over time. And along with those changing ideas, there's also been this slow but important shift towards recognizing that sexual orientation might have a biological basis.
So moving away from the idea that it's a choice or a moral failing.
Exactly. Early sexologists, like Havelock Ellis, started challenging those older views. Then you had Alfred Kinsey's research, which really opened people's eyes to the diversity of human sexual behavior. And more recently, we've seen all this research on genetics, hormones, and brain structure, which provides more and more evidence that biology plays a big role in sexual orientation.
It's pretty amazing to see how science has helped to change our understanding of something so personal and fundamental.
It really is. But even with all this scientific progress, we still have a long way to go in terms of achieving widespread societal acceptance. It's a journey, and it's still ongoing.
That's true. It's not just about knowing the science. It's about changing hearts and minds.
Right. Okay, so now I think it's time to get into the ethics of all this.
Okay, so the ethics of sexuality. Where do we even begin with that?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of different philosophical perspectives on what's considered moral or immoral when it comes to sex.
So not everyone agrees on what's right and wrong.
Exactly. And that's okay. The sources talk about different ethical frameworks, like deontology, which focuses on rules and duties, utilitarianism, which is all about maximizing happiness and well-being, and virtue ethics, which emphasizes developing good character.
Okay, so different ways of thinking about morality.
Right. And depending on which framework you use, you might come to different conclusions about, say, the ethics of premarital sex or having relationships with multiple partners.
I see. So it's not always a clear-cut answer.
Often not. And cultural norms play a huge role in how we think about these things, too. Like, in some cultures, monogamy is the norm, but in others, having multiple partners is more acceptable.
Right, so there's a lot of variation.
A lot. But one thing that has become central in modern discussions of sexual ethics is consent.
Okay, consent. That seems pretty basic. Why is it so important?
Because it's all about respecting each person's autonomy and their right to make their own choices about their body and their sexual experiences.
So it's not just about saying yes or no.
Right. For consent to be valid, it needs to be freely given, informed, and enthusiastic. There can't be any coercion, manipulation, or deception involved.
That makes sense. And it's really what separates healthy and ethical sexual interactions from assault or abuse.
Exactly. Now, of course, you can't talk about sexual ethics without bringing in religion.
Right, because religious beliefs often have a big influence on how people view sexuality.
For sure. And a lot of religious traditions emphasize things like purity, fidelity within marriage, and procreation.
And historically, there's been a lot of condemnation from religious institutions of sexual acts that don't lead to having children, as well as same-sex relationships.
That's true. But it's also important to remember that there's a lot of diversity within and between different religions. And in many religious communities today, we're seeing a move towards more inclusive and accepting views.
So it's not always black and white.
Definitely not. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of the ethical ground. Now let's talk about how sexuality affects us on a personal level, emotionally and psychologically.
I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. Because it's not just about the physical act or the social rules, it's about how we feel about ourselves and our place in the world.
Exactly. And one of the big things here is that sexuality plays a key role in forming our identity. Our sexual orientation and gender identity are fundamental parts of who we are, and accepting those parts of ourselves is crucial for our well-being.
But that process of self-discovery and acceptance can be difficult, can't it? Especially for people who identify as LGBTQ+Y+.
Definitely. They often face a lot of stigma and discrimination, which can make it harder to embrace who they are.
And then there's the role sexuality plays in our relationships.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a powerful force in forming bonds, building trust, and creating intimacy.
You know, we talked about those hormones oxytocin and dopamine earlier. They're released during sex, And they really seem to play a big role in promoting those feelings of closeness and connection between partners.
They do. And those shared experiences of sexual intimacy can strengthen a relationship in so many ways. It can deepen feelings of love, affection, and security. But it's important to remember that a fulfilling relationship doesn't necessarily have to include sexual intimacy.
Right, it's about finding what works for each individual and couple.
Exactly. And finally, the sources talk about how sexuality can impact our self-esteem and overall well-being.
Okay, I can see how that would be a big factor. So what's the connection there?
Well, when people have positive sexual experiences, it can boost their confidence and help them feel good about their bodies. And accepting your sexual orientation and gender identity can also lead to greater self-esteem and better mental health.
Right, so it's all connected.
It is. Unfortunately, the opposite is also true. Negative sexual experiences, stigma, and discrimination can all have a really damaging effect on people's mental and emotional well-being.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's one piece we haven't really delved into yet, the actual physical experience of sexual arousal.
Right. The physiology of it all. So basically, when we become aroused, our bodies go through this amazing cascade of events, and it all starts with some kind of stimulation. That could be anything from seeing someone attractive to, physical touch.
Okay, and then what happens?
Well, that stimulation sends signals to the brain, which then triggers the nervous system to release a bunch of chemicals. And those chemicals lead to increased blood flow to the genitals, which causes an erection in people with penises and lubrication in people with vaginas.
And what about all those other physical changes, like your heart beating faster and breathing more quickly?
That's all part of the process, too. And our hormones, especially testosterone and estrogen, play a key role in how our bodies respond. They influence our desire and how sensitive we are to stimulation.
It's amazing how it all works together. It's like a symphony, really.
It is, and the brain is like the conductor coordinating everything. Now, the ultimate peak of all this arousal is, of course, orgasm.
Okay, so what exactly is happening in our bodies when we orgasm?
Well, it involves a lot of things. There are rhythmic contractions of the pelvic muscles, including those in the vagina and uterus for people with vaginas and the penis and prostate for those with penises.
And what about the feeling of intense pleasure?
That comes from the release of a whole bunch of neurochemicals in the brain, like dopamine and oxytocin.
So it's not just a physical response, it's an emotional and psychological one, too.
Exactly. And did you know that regular sexual activity and orgasm can actually have a bunch of health benefits?
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for one thing, it can help with pain relief. Orgasm releases endorphins, which are natural painkillers. And it can improve sleep because it releases prolactin.
Interesting.
It can also reduce stress, boost your immune system, and might even improve heart health. And for people with prostates, ejaculation might even lower the risk of prostate cancer.
Wow, that's a pretty impressive list. Okay, so now that we've covered the mechanics of sexual arousal and orgasm, I want to talk about how all this develops over time.
Right. Sexual development is a lifelong process. It actually starts in the womb and continues throughout childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood.
So it's not like it just suddenly appears when we hit puberty.
Not at all. But puberty is definitely a big turning point. That's when those sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen really start to surge, leading to the maturation of our reproductive systems and the development of those secondary sex characteristics.
Right, like body hair and breast development.
Exactly. And as our bodies change, so do our sexual interests, attractions, and behaviors. We start exploring romantic and sexual relationships in different ways. And all of this continues to evolve throughout our lives.
That's a really important point. It's not like our sexuality just becomes fixed at a certain age.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we've explored the individual experience of sexuality pretty thoroughly. Now let's talk about how society views and responds to the diversity of sexualities that exist.
Right. So we've talked about sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah.
How are those things perceived and treated in society at large?
Well, honestly, it's a mixed bag. In many Western countries, we're seeing more acceptance and legal recognition of LGBTQ+ people.
Which is a really positive development.
It definitely is, but there's still a lot of prejudice and discrimination out there. We still see harassment, bullying, and even violence directed at LGBTQ+ people just for being who they are.
And it's not just about personal interactions, right? There's also discrimination in things like employment, housing, healthcare, and education.
Unfortunately, yes. LGBTQ+ people often face barriers and prejudice in all those areas. And in some parts of the world, it's even illegal to be gay or transgender.
That's pretty shocking.
It is. And even when there are laws protecting LGBTQ plus rights, those laws aren't always enforced or followed.
So even in places where things are getting better, there's still a lot of work to do.
Definitely. Now, when we dig into the reasons behind all this prejudice and discrimination, it's complicated.
So it's not just one thing.
Right. There are a lot of factors at play. Religion often plays a role, with some religious teachings condemning same-sex relationships. And there are deeply ingrained cultural norms that privilege heterosexuality and traditional gender roles.
And then there's just plain old fear and ignorance.
Right. Absolutely. People are often afraid of what they don't understand, and that fear can easily turn into prejudice.
Right, and that fear is often fueled by misinformation and stereotypes.
Exactly. But on a more positive note, the sources also talk about the LGBTQ plus rights movement and all the progress that's been made thanks to the tireless work of activists and advocates.
That's important to highlight. So what are some of the key things the movement has achieved?
Well, they've been instrumental in changing laws and policies to protect LGBTQ plus people from discrimination. They've raised public awareness through protests, marches, and media campaigns. And they've created support networks for LGBTQ plus individuals and their families.
So they've been fighting on multiple fronts.
They have. And they've achieved some huge victories. Like, in many countries, same-sex marriage is now legal, and there are laws protecting LGBTQ plus people in the workplace.
That's amazing. But it sounds like the fight isn't over yet.
No, not at all. There are still so many issues to address, like violence against LGBTQ plus people, particularly transgender women of color. And we still need to fight for full equality in all areas of life.
So there's still a lot of work to do.
Definitely. Okay, so I want to shift gears a bit now and talk about something that's often overlooked. How children develop an understanding of sexuality.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting area. So when do kids start thinking about sex and gender?
It actually happens much earlier than you might think. Even toddlers start noticing differences between boys and girls and become curious about their bodies.
I remember my niece asking me where babies come from when she was 4 years old.
That's totally normal. Preschoolers are often full of questions about bodies and babies, and they might start engaging in behaviors like touching their genitals or, playing doctor with their friends.
Right, and those behaviors can sometimes freak parents out. But the sources are pretty clear that it's usually just innocent curiosity.
Exactly. It's not about sexual gratification at that age. It's about exploring and trying to understand their bodies and the world around them.
So how does that understanding of sexuality develop as kids get older?
Well, it goes through different stages. As they move into school age, they become more aware of social rules around modesty and privacy, and they might start developing crushes on other kids.
Right, those first pangs of puppy love.
Exactly. And as they enter puberty, their feelings intensify, and they might start exploring romantic and sexual relationships.
So it's a gradual process.
It is. And all along the way, they're being influenced by their families, their peers, the media, and any sex education they receive.
And how they learn about sexuality can vary a lot depending on their culture, right?
Oh, absolutely. Different cultures have different norms and values around sex and gender, and that influences how children are raised and what they're taught.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Not at all. Okay, I think we're nearing the end of our deep dive here. And as we wrap up, I think it's important to circle back to something we talked about earlier. The essential role of sexual reproduction in, life itself.
Right. It's the foundation of so much, isn't it?
It is. For most multicellular organisms, sexual reproduction is the key to generating genetic diversity, which is essential for survival and adaptation. Without it, species would be much more vulnerable to disease and environmental changes.
And we humans are no exception to that rule.
Definitely not. But as we've seen, sexuality for us is about so much more than just making babies. It's about pleasure, intimacy, connection, and identity.
Right. It's about those deeply personal and meaningful experiences that enrich our lives and make us who we are.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing and celebrating the incredible diversity of human sexual expression in all its forms.
I think that's a great note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today, but I hope this deep dive has given our listeners a better understanding of the complexity and beauty of human sexuality.
Me too. And I hope it inspires them to continue exploring and learning both about themselves and about the amazing diversity of human experiences out there.
Absolutely. It's a journey worth taking. So to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep embracing the full spectrum of human sexuality.
This is DigitView.